Let's see if this is alive. Doesn't. Okay, we are live. Just confirmed. So I'll just get the music ready to start off the stream, and I'll put it up that I'm live shortly. So. Okay. So just to share screen. Oh, I should have been more organized, but. So to kick off the stream and allow people to join in, I'll play this for people.
The day of our destiny was darkened. The heart of the nation stood still when Forts Henry and Donaldson surrendered and Johnston fell back to Nashville. But the clouds which then thickened all around us served only the plainer to show the form of that hero arising to deliver us all from the foe. Here's to Forrest from the brave Tennessee. Here's to Forrest from the brave Tennessee. In our hearts he will triumph forever. Here's to Forrest from the brave Tennessee. At Shiloh he charged a division and covered our army's retreat. At Murfreesboro won his promotion when Crittenden admitted his defeat. Next straight went careering before him, expecting our rear to assail. But Forrest with his fair maiden pilot soon landed the robber in jail. Here's to Forrest from the brave Tennessee. Here's to Forrest from the brave Tennessee. In our hearts he will triumph forever. Here's to Forrest from the brave Tennessee. Chickamauga, Chattanooga, Oklahoma, Memphis and Tishomingo Creek, Union City, Fort Pillow, and Paducah, all the deeds of our hero bespeak. Now Athens, Sulphur Springs, and Pulaski have aroused old Sherman from his lair. For the boldest of Yankee commanders will tremble with Forrest in his rear. Here's to Forrest from the brave Tennessee. Here's to Forrest from the brave Tennessee. In our hearts he will triumph forever. Here's to Forrest from the brave Tennessee. Next, Johnsonville attracted his attention, where Sherman had collected his stores, and the gunboats, once terrible to mention, loaded grandly and proudly at his doors. But the Forrest Artillery Battalion, Morton, Rice, and Walton, and Crawl, set fire to Sherman's gunboats and transports, nor ceased till they had burned them all. Here's to Forrest from the brave Tennessee. Here's to Forrest from the brave Tennessee. triumph forever. Here's to Forrest from the brave Tennessee. Here's to Forrest from the brave Tennessee. Here's to Forrest from the brave Tennessee. In our hearts he will triumph forever. Here's to Forrest from the brave Tennessee.
Yep. So that's just about time for everyone else coming out of that match shed. So the topic of this stream will of course be Neville Bedford Forrest, who very much a brilliant man, to say the least, in context of the American Civil War. A very brilliant general in terms of cavalry. Very much nicknamed the Wizard of the Saddle. He was also called a devil. Now I combined devil in the saddle because I felt that devil in the saddle merges the two quotes by William T. Sherman, and the general nickname he had, Wizard of the Saddle, and hence the title is Devil in the Saddle. And this will be part one. It covers from 1821 when Forrest was born, and I'll also talk about his ancestry, and I'll cover right up to the aftermath of the Battle of Chickamauga in September 1863, whereupon, in an argument with Braxton Bragg, who I will talk about in more detail, after that argument, Forrest gets his own command, and that's when really a lot of those acts he does in independent command, such as Fort Pillow, that'll be for next week, in which I will still discuss, for example, the controversy about the Fort Pillow massacre. I will, as well as, of course, post-war controversies such as the Ku Klux Klan, as well as other issues of that sort after the American Civil War, whereupon he did have black people attending his funeral, and many blacks did speak favorably of him, even though before the war he was a slave trader. So this is a guy who's very complicated in American history, because on one hand, no one can deny his brilliance with cavalry. For example, Shelby Foote would often say he, alongside Abraham Lincoln, were the two most brilliant minds that the American Civil War had produced. And he would often say that with Forrest, if he looked at a patch of ground, he could instantly, there's no denying that sense of brilliance on his part in that faculty. Furthermore, another thing about Forrest was he's also eccentric in the sense that he starts the war as a private and ends the war as a lieutenant general, which that is the biggest rise for any single guy in the context of the American Civil War. So that's another thing. Now, granted, I mean, he does get an instantaneous promotion almost, like not long after he signs up for the Confederate Army, because one thing about it is, in a sort of echo to what the British Army did with purchasing commissions, Forrest being a guy of immense wealth, because in 1861, for example, he was a millionaire. He had $1.5 million on him. He had quite a lot of real estate in the states both of Tennessee and Mississippi. He was very much into he very much invested heavily into the slave trade, although he wasn't exclusively a slave trade. He also did get into other businesses, but they weren't nowhere near as profitable as the slave trading. And his pre-war wealth building, like his pre-war life, has plenty of anecdotes with it, let alone the Civil War, where there's so many anecdotes. It's fair to say it's as though Forrest himself was like a god of war in human form. So really, he is not hyperbolic on my part to say that as an outsider looking in, it has to be one of the astounding personalities the Civil War ever produced. And so I shall share screen now. So to start off, the chronology of Neville Bedford Forrest. So, for example, in the context of the American Civil War, you have, for example, he enlists as a private in Tennessee. He raises Kentucky and Tennessee volunteers, and meanwhile, this is what kind of happens in the sidelines. So up until around here, this is when part 1 will end, and part 2 will cover from raiding Western Tennessee up until end of Civil War, as well as covering his post-war life. So, to start off, you have in Hernando, Mississippi, you have this small house which Forrest and his family lived in. Now, the thing about Forrest was, so his father's side of the family, they originally were from Western Virginia, because you got the Forrest family, they are very much 100% British Isles in their ancestry, mixes of English, Ulster Scots, as well as Irish. For example, his mother is Scottish, a woman by the name of Miriam Beck, and she was very much a robust woman. Like, she was nearly 6 foot tall. She was very robustly built, and she bore something like 13 children. One of the eldest of them being Nathan. The only older one than him who survived was John, who Nathan did look up to. You have also a father by the name of William, who dies when Nathan's only 16 years old. And it's from the outset, Nathan really has to start becoming a patriarch in his family alongside John. So, for example, this is what Nathan Bedford looked like before the war. There was his brothers here. So when he was growing up, he grew up on like a small farm. Like, you got a fact of a very well of border stock. So, for example, I don't know for certain, but it's going off like the guy's own behaviour. You can immediately imagine that Nathan Bedford himself must have been descended from the border weavers that used to dog the Anglo-Scottish border back in the middle and early modern periods. And as I mentioned, English, Scottish, and Irish ancestry within him, and he's very much tells in his behaviour. For example, not long after his father died, he pretty much is in charge of a family farm. It's a small farm, by the way. It's not a particularly wealthy family, and you got over a dozen children to care for. Although Forrest, he has something like 8 or 9 brothers, if memory serves me right, of whom 3 of them don't live to adult. Something like 2 of them don't live to adulthood. He has 4 sisters, 3 of whom die. Disease like typhus and tuberculosis claim him, as did many people, including Prince Albert. So it didn't matter whether you're poor or rich. Typhus and other diseases of that sort would claim your life. It was just the brutality of life. And the thing about the Forrest family, they always lived on the frontier. A lot of Southerners were, and that's the thing. So the same with Andrew Jackson. Like, Andrew Jackson, I believe, also has Ulster Scots and sort of Scottish border weaver type of ancestry. And that's the thing. So Forrest family in the late 18th, early 19th century, they sort of lived in Western Virginia as well as South Carolina. And then they moved from South Carolina into Tennessee. This is one reason why, for example, Tennessee joins a confederacy upon the eve of a civil war, basically, because Tennessee, you got guys like Andrew Jackson with his famous Hermitage home, among others, where many South Carolinians just move over to Tennessee because you always have this constant westward expansion, and you have land that's cleared of the natives, cleared up for future settlement, where you might have a state, let's say South Carolina or Virginia, where they think, well, better opportunities elsewhere. So you have Forrest, who at the age of 16, he loses his father, and he's very much having to really be a man. For example, one anecdote of his time is that he had a neighbour who had an ox who kept infesting the family corn. Like, they had a few cornfields which they depended on. They were subsistence farmers, of course. This neighbour of theirs was told explicitly, look, if that ox keeps going into our crop, Nathan himself will come out with his come outside with his musket and shoot the beast dead. The neighbour did not listen, and so Forrest shot the animal dead. But the neighbour also came out with his own double-barreled shotgun, as if to try and intimidate Forrest. But the thing about Forrest was, he was 6'2", and he weighed something like 188 pounds, so that would be like 82 kilos or thereabouts. So you can imagine how intimidating he was, just in build and demeanor. Like, as with illustracy ancestry, which, as I've mentioned, he really does measure up to the part. Like, very intimidating guy. Like, he was soft spoken, as many Southerners were. Like, this is one thing that befuddles me to this day, how you can get Southerners such as Forrest or Lee or Jackson, who they have quite illustrious and almost intimidating reputations, and yet have some of the softest speaking voices of that time. Like, you can imagine. Yeah, marked everyone. Yeah, because it's like, for example, as Matt mentioned, his mother was like nearly 6 foot, and his father, like, both sides of his family were known for being tall and being fairly robust in build. So it's fair to say Forrest himself was. It's like genetics naturally blessed him. So yeah, when you have Forrest in his early adulthood, one thing he's helped. One time there was he and his brothers, led by their eldest brother John, they went over to volunteer to help Texas in 1841. So Forrest at this point was 19 or 20. The thing about Texas was, because it was settled by southern American statesmen, you had guys at the forests who were willing to volunteer to help Texas ward off. Not just, oftentimes it could be like the likes of Comanche, which, if you look at maps of Texas, especially in northwestern Texas, like you think of areas like Lubbock in the northwest, very urbanized areas, because it had to be, because a Comanche would just kill off any rural family in the area. Or Mexico, after they got defeated so badly in 1836, they would still be seething about it, and there was always constant threat up until annexation under, I forget the name of the president. It wasn't James K. Polk, it was the one right before him. But yeah, James K. Polk, he expands America in the Mexican War. So you have the Forrest brothers. They go over to New Orleans to catch a ship to take them to Galveston in eastern Texas. However, they get to New Orleans, and all the volunteers find there's no ship awaiting them. Now, the Forrest do not quit, and they still get to Galveston on a ship that later than they planned. Then we got to Galveston and found out Texas was no longer in need of them. But the problem was, especially on the part of Nathan, they did not have the money to get back home. So in the end, what happened was, you just had this situation where for 4 months, the brothers, including Nathan, had to work up 50 cents a day, working with railways and such, before they had to save up for 4 months before they could get back to Tennessee, get back to Hernando, northern Mississippi. Now, at this time, John, the eldest brother, has been maimed. Like, he lost the use of his legs fighting the Mexicans. So now it's up to Nathan to really be the breadwinner for the family. So you have Nathan. He gets into slave trading with his uncle Jonathan, and they do all right in Hernando in northern Mississippi. However, what happens is they get into competition with the Matlock brothers, and the Matlock brothers, they kill off Jonathan in front of Nathan. Nathan shoots 2 of them dead and wins the other 3 with a Bowie knife that someone else in the public borrows him, because it's worth noting that in the case with stretchers all the time. Yeah, as I mentioned, you got the Comanche, because it'd be terrifying. You do have the Texas Rangers of that time, but it's still a matter of, like, you get native tribes and you get other stuff. Like, it's better, those areas of the Southern states aren't as developed as they are today. So yeah, it's fair to say as well, it required also, there was a great sense of initiative and daring do on part of the Forrest family, especially Nathan himself, but also his brothers deserve an honorary mention for that score. So yeah, you have the Forrest. They get over to northern Mississippi and into Tennessee. The thing about it was, so the slave trade, it's worth knowing that it was seen as disreputable for the time. And if I can get a quote up, if the damn thing loads. Bloody thing ain't loading. Yeah, but it's worth noting, just to say the least, that slave trading was very seen as disreputable, and people who were slave trading was seen as unscrupulous, not very trustworthy people. Forrest, for a time, like he's able to get by, like he's able, he's not worried about the reputation because you got to say he's not from the same illustrious planter aristocracy stock as someone like Robert E. Lee was. So yeah, just to get a quote, so what Forrest had been doing up to this time, selling slaves while also trading in other farm supplies, was not only common but also natural back then. To sell the other farm supplies, the merchant had to get to know other farmers and planters who also needed to buy and sell slaves. And he was already engaged in the kind of rural sales excursions that slave trading demanded. There was a kind of stigma attached to full-time slave trading, for uprooting one's human property from its home and releasing it to the whims of prospective buyers was viewed with such distaste that to have to sell slaves at all was a sign of financial trouble amongst the rich. Fancying itself humane, the aristocracy, fancying itself humane, sorry, not inhumane, humane, the aristocracy regarded slave trading as a way coarse pretenders could gain entry, if not wholehearted acceptance, into the planter class by trafficking in misery. We find Mary Ann Forrest. Reiterate. So here you have Forrest as a young man. He's not got the beard and he's not got the major look we all know him as, but this is him at the age of 24 in 1845. He rescues a stranded Mary Ann Montgomery because they got trapped in the middle of a swamp in the middle of Mississippi. Now, it's worth noting, Mary Ann Montgomery was from illustrious stock. Like her, I forget his grandfather or great-grandfather, who was the American general who got himself killed at the Battle of Quebec in 1775 in the winter, because it's not really well known, but the Americans tried to take Quebec off the British Empire in the midst of a Revolutionary War because they thought Quebec, being full of French people who were vengeful about losing to us, would rise up with them. But yeah, sad to say, they did not. So yeah, for an ambitious Forrest, marrying Mary Ann Montgomery was very much a great advantage because she had a bit of wealth. Now, Forrest, it was so the second time they saw each other, not long after this in 1845. So Forrest asks for Mary Ann for marriage. She ducks it the first time, but on the third time they meet, Mary Ann agrees to the marriage. And the thing is, her uncle, who was a legal guardian because her father was dead, he said, "No, I do not trust you to have Mary Ann's interests at heart because you're a gambler and you swear too much." And she's a good Christian woman. And Forrest is like, "Yeah, that's what I want her." So yeah, just like these anecdotes, you understand. I'm building him up to the character that he's very audacious. Like there's nothing that unnerves him. Very brave. Some people might say reckless. I mean, I say reckless. The only time people say recklessness is when bravery results in failure or or undue risk. So, but yeah, it's fair to say Forrest, very audacious guy. Nothing troubles him. Yeah. So to get on back to the quote. So we find Mary Ann Forrest may have resisted the idea of full-time slave trading, but her husband was never sought to quibble over appearances. He wanted a way to prosper quickly, and at that time and place, there was no other profitable field than slave dealing. So yeah, it's fair to say that with Forrest, he gets into slave trading full-time. Because the thing was, in the late 1840s, he did try to get into bricklaying over in because the thing was, after that feud with the Matlock brothers, the way ends, and his uncle being killed, he moves over to Memphis, Tennessee. The thing about Memphis, Tennessee was it was located along the Mississippi River, and the Mississippi River being a massive waterway, because it wasn't just the Mississippi River, but you had rivers like the Tennessee, the Cumberland, the Ohio. You had numerous rivers that all paid tribute into the Mississippi. So if you had Memphis had a good port along the way, because you have New Orleans, which is like the entrepot of any trade between, let's say for example, you were a factory owner. Let's say you wanted cotton made by slaves in Mississippi. What would happen is you'd have, let's say, somewhere like Vicksburg or further south like New Orleans. but cotton would be transported there, loaded onto a ship, and then it would go by the ship to New York. Because it's worth noting that before because railways were still fairly new, so it's like, and you also had like canals being fairly new. For example, to get an image of how bad travel could be, I mean, Liverpool and Manchester in England are only like not even 20 miles away from one another. But up until stuff like canals and railways stopped really being adopted, to get from Liverpool to Manchester or vice versa would take you longer than it would be to take a ship from Liverpool to New York. So yeah, New Orleans and other ports along the Mississippi, such as Vicksburg and Memphis, really build up as a massive entrepot to the slave trade. And it's worth noting as well that certain attributes among slaves were very much treasured. For example, I believe it was 1828, if memory serves me right, where transatlantic slave trading was practically forbidden, because of pressure from the British Empire with the West Africa Squadron and so on. So what happened was the slave traders, they're now can only deal in slaves within America, and this is why you get a situation where in 1830 the slave population was 2 million. By 1860 it was 4 million, because they would just sell slaves who were known for being very fertile, to say the least. It was kind of like breeding farms, so to speak. Like you'd have like slave traders and who could sell slaves at a really good premium if they were proven to be fertile. So yeah, this is why like the slave population doubled in the space of 30 years, because you no longer had that Atlantic slave trade going from West Africa to, let's say, New Orleans. You have to now just deal with the slaves you've got. And these measures were more like sort of gradual means of abolishing slavery. So yeah. The thing about so you do have Forrest, who moves over to Memphis, and he creates a business with a guy called Josiah Maples on Adam Street in Memphis, where they deal in all kinds of slaves, like field hands, house servants, mechanics. We also friendly girls. Friendly girls, basically, these are like female slaves who are there for sexual purposes. So, for example, Frederick Douglass, like his own niece, actually got sold by Forrest at one point in the 1850s, because it's worth knowing that the business, this Forrest and Maples, is set up between 1854 to 1859, because what happens in 1859 is that Forrest, he decides he's investing a fair bit of real estate in both Tennessee and Mississippi, and after a while, once he gets to because at this point, in the late by 1860, he's worth like $1.5 million, which in today's money would be like $35 million or something like that. So very wealthy guy, and it's at this point as well he gets into politics, where he becomes an alderman for Memphis. Now, he's brought in because he's got great business acumen, like very shrewd trader. And Memphis at this time, they were in debt, they had like a deficit of $30,000 year after year, because the city, like the municipal government, just kept living beyond its means. So they bring in Forrest as an alderman, and he does bring in these fair means, and it's worth noting as well that one thing from the outset is he's not personally corrupt. I mean, it's worth noting that Forrest, he doesn't drink, he doesn't smoke, he does gamble, but by this point in the game, like he's mainly known as like a very shrewd trader, a very upstanding businessman for the community, and his slave trading brings a lot of money into Memphis. Hence, he becomes alderman on a Southern Democrat ticket. Now, that Southern Democrat ticket does help him later on in the Civil War when he gets promoted instantaneously from private up to sort of brigadier general. Because the thing was, he rubs shoulders with the Tennessee Southern Democrat elites, such as the Southern Democrat governor by the name of Isham G. Harris. So yeah, you have Forrest. Now, although he is involved in local politics, in the 1860 election, where you have like 4 presidential candidates, you have Abraham Lincoln for the Republican Party, you've got Stephen A. Douglas for Northern Democrats, for Southern Democrats, you have John C. Breckinridge, who later becomes a Confederate general from Kentucky, and then you have the Constitutional Union Party. So basically, the pro-slavery vote was split almost 3 ways. Meanwhile, the anti-slavery vote was it just all Lincoln, and some people say that the southern states forbade Lincoln off a ballot. That's actually not true. The thing about American elections of this time was that they were based off tickets. So it's not like what you think of today with a ballot, where you have like a list of options and you tick, or that you cross and then you put in a box. Now that you have a ticket, it doesn't work the same way. So the Republican Party being an anti-slavery party by this point, though they weren't explicitly so, they just opposed expanding slavery, which at this point anyway meant basically you're going to get rid of slavery anyway in the long run. Yeah, so you have the northern, like we have the Democrats split between the northern and southern branches, the Constitutional Union Party that tried to do a middle ground, and then you've got the Republicans of the Lincoln, who are very much anti-slavery vote. The Republicans win fairly handily, and this is where you get secession coming in. Now, South Carolina is the first state to secede on 20th of December, 1861. Now, it's worth noting that initially Tennessee was they were on the same page as Virginia, which was they were hoping for more, they were hoping to have a sort of middle ground solution. But the problem was when you have Fort Sumter bombarded, this later leads to Tennessee seceding because Lincoln calls up the volunteers, and the state of Tennessee, of course, most guys in Tennessee are descended from guys who moved from South Carolina. They're not going to bear arms against South Carolina. Same goes for Virginia, and they secede alongside Arkansas. And yeah, this is where you get Nathan Bedford Forrest taking up the call to arms in mid-June 1861. At first, he's a private, but Isham G. Harris, he notices that Forrest is only a private, and he thinks that's not right. So he pulls some strings, and he goes from private to brigadier general, commanding a force of cavalry. He's sent to collect up a force of cavalry and some many cavalry, yeah. And he also has like small artillery battery, like a couple of 12-pounders that he uses later on a guy called Freeman. So yeah, you have this case where Forrest, he's now drumming up volunteers all over Tennessee and Kentucky, because it's worth noting Kentucky they formally are neutral, but they do become a battleground state fairly early on. You know, Forrest, he actually goes into Kentucky because he bought some saddles and whatnot, because the Confederate Army, from the outset, they had to start almost from square one, because with a lot of the equipment. For example, you have uniforms not being much of a thing, because the Union Army, they already have the blue uniform, and the grey uniform isn't formally adopted yet. Then you've got saddles, you've got guns. I mean, a lot of the guys who are brought onto Forrest's cavalry unit, they're coming with like double-barreled shotguns bought from their farms. And the thing about these guys is because they're small-time farmers, they can't afford to enlist for long times. It's the same with the American Revolutionary War, where you have like 1 year enlistments. And this is one thing that Forrest has to struggle with at first, is a lot of these guys are with the Confederates and with him, so long as the Confederacy are seen as winning the war or seen as like a good side. But as soon as things go against them, or as soon as, like, say, things go bad in terms of, for example, there's a drought in Kentucky later on in the war, so that puts a dampener on recruiting efforts. So yeah. So you get into December 1861. Now, one of the first actions he does is, so around this area, I think it's like north. It was north of the Hopkins or somewhere around here. A lot of Confederate sympathizers in Kentucky were taken captive by a load of Union troops from Illinois. So what Forrest does is he goes over to around here, like around Marlin. He takes a load of pro-Union Christian preachers captive, and he says to this Illinois unit, he says to them, look, if you do not release these Confederate sympathizers you've taken captive, I will hang all of these Union-supporting clergymen from St. Paul. Because of the language he uses in such a forceful way, those Confederate sympathizers are released fairly shortly, and most clergymen are released fairly shortly as well from Forrest. So already from the outset, he starts off with a fairly good bang. so to speak. And later on in that same month, you have a small battle at Sacramento where it's more of a skirmish rather than a full-blown battle. But what happens is, so Forrest, it's worth noting that he never went to West Point. Before the war, he's like Cromwell in the sense that he's never served in a military unit, has no military training, can't even join a company. Like, he's not known for being good at military discipline. And yet he becomes really well known as a great cavalry commander, one of the most brilliant minds, as Shelby Foote would say. So you have Battle of Sacramento where he outflanked. There's this Union force of like around 600 guys. He's got also like a force of like 500, give or take. And what he does is the Union are encamped up on a hill, and they think because they have the high ground, they're able to win. They're able to just fend them off. But what he does is he outflanks them. He doesn't do a frontal attack. And this is one thing about Forrest. He never does a frontal attack at all. He outflanks this Union force. And in case of his Battle of Sacramento in western Kentucky, west of the Green River, Forrest only suffers something like 2 killed and 3 wounded, while the Union side, according to Confederate sources, lose around 135 casualties. Now, because of Forrest's own bravery, he was commanding the troops on the front line himself. He was charging, and he does get a horse killed from underneath him, and he loses 30 horses throughout the entire war, as well as the outflanking maneuver. It is fair to say that I'm more inclined to believe that the casualties were more of a triple-digit figure rather than a double-digit figure that Union sources claim, because it's worth noting as well that inexperience affects both sides. But with someone like Forrest at the helm, he's able to get his troops to behave according to orders just by sheer force of will. And there are many anecdotes where, for example, later on in the war, for example, he has one time where a scout gives him false information. So he gets a scout, grabs him by the scruff of his neck and bashes his head against a tree. Because one thing about Forrest is he's got an almighty temper. You can clearly say he's got Scottish in him by the fact that he's got an almighty temper. And yeah, so Battle of Sacramento from the outset, this is like a small microcosm of his skills, so to speak. So he was based in Greenville, and he was there. He was up here drilling up volunteers. Now, in February 1862, you have the Fort Henry of Donelson. Now, the thing about Fort Henry is along the Tennessee River, as it straddles along Kentucky and Tennessee, and it goes down where it later meets up with the Mississippi. And then you have Fort Donelson along the Cumberland River. Now, the thing about the Cumberland River especially is if Fort Donelson falls, Nashville falls too, because it's further down the river, and the Union, one thing we have from the outset is pretty much you've got superiority of gunships along the rivers. Like, the Confederates don't really have much of a navy. They have some ironclads and stuff like that, but when they get blockaded, you have to deal with Grant. He's really good at working with the navy. Yeah, this is what happens. So Fort Henry falls to the navy solo under I forget what rank. He wasn't Commodore. I think he was a flag officer. Flag officer, because of course it wasn't until later on in the Civil War you get admirals in the army. So yeah, you have Fort Henry, which falls early February, and then you have Fort Donelson, which from February 12th to February 15th, you have Fort Donelson besieged. Now, at first, the thing is, if the Confederates look set to hold, because they've got around 15,000 men, you've got guys like John B. Floyd. Now, the thing about John B. Floyd was, up until the Civil War starting, he was the Secretary of War under James Buchanan. Up until Lincoln taking office, Floyd was, as Secretary of War, he was actually funneling weapons and material from the north into the south, so that when the shells fall on Fort Sumter and the Civil War starts, all these weapons that John B. Floyd rerouted to southern arsenals are easily taken. And this is why, when later on in the siege, you have Floyd who makes a decision that he's not going to stick around for surrendering. Because the thing was, you do have Grant, you got McClernand, C.F. Smith, and McClernand McClellan, by the way, he's a political general. He's quite competent, but he's very insubordinate, and he does screw up Grant. And I'll mention him more when I do Ulysses Grant later on. Well, when I do Grant, inevitably when I do Ulysses Grant, mid to late April, whereabouts. So McClellan, I'll mention him more. But yeah, so you have Forrest. Meanwhile, he skirmishes. Now it's this skirmish here that alerts we've got Floyd, Pillow, and Buckner over to the fact of the Federal advance. So they march along two roads, a Telegraph Road and a Ridge Road, for ease of access. So yeah, you have Fort Donelson, which you notice here the river, like two Federal gunboats that are driven off by this water battery around here, and you got Hickman Creek, which this is why you don't see an attack from this angle. You have General Smith on the left flank here. He's going up against Buckner. You also got Buckner. He commands around here. Meanwhile, you have Pillow commanding the Confederate left around here and against McClellan. Now, and you have Wallace in the centre. Now, at first, yeah, all assaults at first have fended off. Smith actually was he dies later on in the year. You got General McClellan, who he attacks. Later on in the siege, you have a counterattack on February 15th, where there was only like a single regiment, I believe, or not even that, perhaps even a single battalion. Like, he was really lackluster on this thing. They rerouted all forces to the Confederate left to do a counterattack on McClellan, and he actually really succeeds. However, indecision amongst the Confederate leadership, mainly Floyd, Gideon Pillow, and Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr., initially they were thinking, well, we need to get the heck out of Dodge. Like, we need to link up back up with Albert Sidney Johnston, who at this time is leading all Confederate forces in the Western Theater. Like, he was actually, I believe he was the only 4-star general to join the Confederate Army at this stage of the war. And so Johnston, he's got forces up in over in like mid Tennessee, and he says to the garrison of Fort Donelson beforehand, look, if you have to abandon the fort, get every man you've got and join me, because it's worth noting that Grant and another guy called Buell, they've combined forces like 70,000, and this is one reason why you get the initial attack. Basically, what happened was the leadership, they think this has gone too well. Like, they think it's too good to be true, and they just don't push on to leave down this road towards Clarksville and later on to Tennessee. They just don't believe that they just don't believe that Grant's army is easily that beatable. So they just dither, and the men are just standing there, just thinking, "What do we do now?" So they pull back into the fort, and Grant later gets reinforced so that the Confederates, they always, like Floyd and Pillow especially, they always thought that they were outnumbered massively, because they had a force of 15,000. They thought they were besieged by something like 50,000. Actually, at the very most, it was 27,000, especially by the time Grant gets later reinforced. So had they carried on this attack and run down this road, they would have been able to. But yeah, the leadership, Floyd and Pillow, they later made the decision to surrender the fort. However, they're not going to stay there. Floyd, as mentioned, he doesn't want to go because he knows full well that he's going to get done for treason if the Union catches him. So he's not going to stick around. Second guy is Gideon Pillow, who thought he was God's gift to the Confederacy. To say the least, like, he was very narcissistic, and he was initially in favour of staying behind at the fort, but then he's the first guy to flee before the surrender takes place. So it falls upon Simon Bolivar Buckner Jr. to surrender the fort. And Buckner Jr. does it because he knows that he knows Grant personally, because he lent money to Grant previously, back when Grant was skint in before the war. So he thinks he's going to get good terms. But yeah, Forrest, meanwhile, when he finds out, because he took part in this audacious flanking maneuver, and he wanted it to go ahead even more and get on down to Nashville. But yeah, these guys just differ. He's disgusted when he hears of what happened, when you have this assault just dither. And then later, you have him escaping from Fort Donelson, because he's saying, look, I'm not coming here to surrender my command. And he decides to, and this is where he moves out on the night of February 15th to 16th. He gets out. Something like 3,000 men are able to escape from a trap, but you still have something like 12,000 Confederates under Buckner Jr. forced to surrender, and that loss would be keenly felt later on in the Battle of Shiloh, which really was a bloodbath for both sides. Like, there was no great tactical flourishes in a battle; it was just both sides. There's that quote that Helmut von Moltke the Elder said of both American armies in the Civil War just being two mobs going at one another, and Shiloh kind of feels like it because both sides. There's no great tactical flourishes. It's not like Chancellorsville where you had an audacious flanking maneuver like Jackson did. Shiloh is just two sides just lobbing men at one another, and very bloody affair. So yeah, in the midst of the escape, you have Forrest's own horse gets killed by a shell. I believe this horse was named Roderick. One thing, even despite losing loads of horses, he still does name his horses fairly well. And you do have this situation where a Federal battery was actually captured in the initial assault. And yet you also have Confederate infantry escaping alongside Forrest. And you also got the artillerists escaping a lot across Lick Creek east to the southeast of the fort. So in early April 1862, you have a Battle of Shiloh, and you do have these positions. For example, we have Pittsburgh Landing, which is why I'm in me. So the Confederates call it Shiloh because that's near, because Shiloh Church, and Shiloh ironically means place of peace in Hebrew. And the thing about, so the Confederates call it Shiloh while the Union call it Battle of Pittsburgh Landing, because of course, as aforementioned, the Confederates name battles after places while the Union name it after rivers. So for example, you got the Confederates, they have an army. They might call it the Army of Tennessee or the Army of, let's say, the Shenandoah or Army of Northern Virginia. Meanwhile, in this case, the Union Army under Grant is called the Army of the Ohio. I mean, later on you have the Army of the Tennessee, I believe it is. Army of Ohio is Buell. Sorry, slight mistake there. Yeah, so you have troop distributions. You have Sherman on the right flank. Sherman on the right flank. You got Wallace, who arrives on the second day. McClernand in the center. You got Hurlbut, you got McClernand, you got Prentice. Prentice actually leads the Hornet's Nest, which very bloody affair. And yeah, very bloody affair. Now I will talk about this battle in more detail when I talk about William T. Sherman in a couple of weeks' time, as well as Ulysses S. Grant after that. But yeah, let's just say you have Forrest. He's held behind on the right flank, besides Breckinridge and Bragg. Meanwhile, and it was just a slog for both sides. Both sides do. You have the Union troops under Grant who just did not expect the Confederates to attack, so they weren't dug in, and the initial surprise really screws them over. However, Braxton Bragg especially and Polk, they just do these frontal attacks. They just don't bother trying to outflank the Union forces. They just do these massive frontal attacks. And this is why the casualties are so heavy for the Confederates, never mind the Union side. Now, so the battle happens over April 6th and 7th. And by the end of the second day, you just have this position where the battle is lost. Albert Sidney Johnston, he does get wounded, as mentioned here. He gets wounded around here. It's worth noting that some people think he was killed off by the Union troops. No, it wasn't. He was mortally wounded in the leg with an Enfield bullet, which the Enfields were wielded by the Confederate troops. None of the Union troops were using Enfield muskets. And the thing about Johnston was he didn't actually feel the bullet enter his leg, because during the Texas War in 1836 against the Mexicans, he actually had a duel with another officer in the U.S. Army at that time, and he actually suffered some nerve damage to his right leg. So when he gets a bullet through his right leg that severs his femoral artery, he doesn't actually feel it. All they know is his right boot is filling up with blood, and that's when and at 2:30 in the afternoon of the first day on April 6th, he dies. PGT Beauregard takes over command. However, news of Johnston's death does not spread to the Confederate Army because PGT Beauregard says, "Look, we cannot, we cannot be seen. Like we cannot let the army's morale be sunk because it's worth noting that the army's morale was sunk previously because of stuff like fall of Fort Henry at Donelson, as well as previous defeats, where, for example, even on the march to this battle, they were originally meant to fight on April 5th, originally, but Braxton Bragg, he lost a division on the way. Like they just got lost on the way on the road. And Albert Senior Johnston, who was usually collected, he was very much stressed out and just really irritable, contrary to his nature. And Johnston, at this point in the battle, in the afternoon, he was actually going out, sword in hand, rallying the men to push on. Again, this is not typical of him. He was kind of going where to stay back, but he was in a sense of desperation mode, and he had to egg on the men to take the Hornet's Nest because he knew full well that he had to defeat Grant before Buell can come in and reinforce. Unfortunately, later on April 6th into April 7th on the night, Nathan Bedford Forrest, he notices that Buell has come to reinforce. Like he hears along Pittsburgh Landing, like he's around here. I believe he hears, like he's around this waterway. He can hear Union voices around here, where he hears the Army of the Ohio under Buell. They're crossing the Tennessee and reinforcing Grant come the morning. He goes over to tell the general. Now he doesn't know at this time that Johnston was wounded and died. He didn't know that he was meant to see PGT Beauregard. He does go up to a guy called James Chalmers, who later will get mentioned in part 2 because he serves under Forrest when Forrest gets his independent command in 1863-64 time. But yeah, he goes up to James Chalmers, who's like a mid-rank officer alongside him, and Chalmers, yeah, he can't help Forrest because basically it's worth noting about Forrest. Braxton Bragg especially did not like him because he found that Forrest was too audacious. He was too maverick. Because Braxton Bragg was very much a disciplinarian. He was one of the most horrible generals on the Confederate side of a civil war. Like he had no concept of getting on well with people. Like for example, during the Mexican War, Bragg nearly got killed off by his own men because they tried to put an artillery shell underneath his bed. It exploded when he was up toilet. So it's fair to say, like Bragg, even back in the Mexican War, let alone in this war, he'll be really hated amongst the men and guys who serve underneath him later on. And Forrest is one of those guys. So yeah, Forrest, he's frustrated. He can't get word out to the appropriate authorities in question that the army of Grant is being reinforced. So come the morning of April 7th, yeah, the Confederates get chucked back, and PGT Beauregard is forced to call a retreat by the end of April 7th. Now, on the following day, April 8th, at a place, I don't think it's on this map, but it would be around like here, I imagine, somewhere like a place called Fallen Timbers, where Breckinridge, his troops, their retreat had to be covered by Forrest as a rear guard. So Forrest, he has his cavalry command. They charge into the Union Army ranks, into the skirmishers dispatched by Sherman. And the thing was, yeah, so you see here, like, Battle of Fallen Timbers, you have this position where Breckinridge is commanding the rear guard, and you got Forrest, who's also commanding. He charges into Sherman's skirmish line, and you get this. So what happened was, Forrest, he actually charged into the Union lines. He does not know that his fellow cavalry men, they did not follow him. So he's stranded in the midst of this line of Union skirmishers. They're all shouting, "Kill him! Kill him!" And the thing was, he realized it too late. He was shooting with his Colt revolver into this crowd of huddled Union soldiers as well as slashing with his saber, and then he gets shot with a musket ball into his spine by a Lawrence Austrian musket. lodges him to his spine, nearly knocks him off his saddle, and his horse, I forget the name of the horse in question, does get mortally wounded, but the horse does carry him for a fair while after this. But what happens is Forrest, he takes this Union soldier, this small Union soldier who's like barely 5 foot, by the scruff of his neck, and uses the guy as a human shield, so that he's able to get away from the Union forces. It's only when he's out of danger's way that he chucks off his Union soldier who he just abducted for use as a human shield. And it's something like 10 days later after the battle, he later gets treated by a surgeon who removes this musket ball, which just about missed his spine. And this operation has to be done without anesthesia. So you can imagine the amount of pain that Forrest had to go through for this particular, I suppose you could say recklessness for this part, because it really was undue risk on his part, because there wasn't like a rear guard on the Breckenridge without having to pull back. So yeah, this particular anecdote this is just like another anecdote in a long list of anecdotes where it's just like, bloody hell, like you really understand Forrest has been a very audacious guy and bordering on recklessness, some people would say. So later on in the year, you get into July 1862, where he's tasked with raiding into mid Tennessee as well as into southern Kentucky to harass Union supply lines. Now, this place here, so you have, he sets off, goes through this way, McMinnville, then he goes over to Sparta, and then on July 13th, he comes across Murfreesboro in central Tennessee. Now, Murfreesboro, in the case of taking that little town, the thing was, he attacked the town in three simultaneous thrusts. A lot of Union troops were holed up in the courthouse, just shooting down his men from a second story. So what he does is, instead of storming the building and incurring immense casualties, what happens is, you have the courthouse just get burned. Like he just orders the courthouse to be burned down. It's after that particular case where Forrest really gets his reputation as being a very ruthless guy. Certainly one that started to get dreaded by Union soldiers and Union officers. I'm aware, yeah. So yeah, after this, he goes on past places like Smyrna and Antioch. And this is one funny thing for me. It's that you do have these places in like Tennessee, you got Kentucky, you also got Ohio, where he's place names named after like places we have in Europe. For example, you've got Glasgow in southern Kentucky, you've got Antioch, named after Antioch in the Middle East. You've got Fayetteville, named after Lafayette. You've got Pulaski, named after, I forget his name, Pulaski, a cavalry officer from the Revolutionary War. You got Manchester, and you got Sparta as well, for that matter. Yeah, so you have here, so Murfreesboro goes here, raiding all over the place around this sort of rectangular area, I suppose you could say, of mid Tennessee, especially raiding Nashville, which was the first state capital to fall to the Union forces. But so Nashville had fallen earlier, and then he later raids into areas like Munfordville and Elizabethtown and Bardstown, and then that's it. And you notice as well, he goes along the railways, because the railway lines are really the main junctions you need for supplies. So Grant, for example, Grant is a quartermaster, so he understands the logistical burden, and this is why Grant and Sherman, especially, they really get to see Forrest in all his prime, and they really see him as a major threat to their supply lines for the rest of the war. Now, you see here Sparta, he says based here during most of August, and then he joins up with Bragg for the advance north, because you have what was called the Confederate Heartland campaign, where Bragg, he got a delegation from Kentucky that was saying, if you come into Kentucky, a lot of Kentuckians will join you, because at this point of the war, like there was in Missouri, John C. Fremont, he was actually going of his way to free the slaves, in Missouri, which really irked off people in that neck of the woods. Missouri being a slave state, of course, and the Kentuckians being a slave state, although at this time normally on the Union side, some of them were actually itching for Bragg to join them. But the thing was, yeah, it's kind of like what Robert E. Lee tried to do with Maryland in the lead up to Antietam. He thought he was going into Maryland and recruiting loads of guys, but the problem is the parts that Bragg does get into, they're not the parts of Kentucky he needs to go into to recruit men, and he does get beaten back anyway. A lot of the problem with that, of course, being the fact that literally he's very incompetent and foolish how he deploys his men. So yeah, you have all over here. You have Parker's Crossroads on December 31st. Now the thing was, yeah, you do have, for example, you have here like arrows, you have Trenton, Rutherford, crosses the Albion River, and gets to Union City, where he does come across a small Union force of like 200 guys who he forces to surrender because he uses 12-pounders in a very fair to say that with Forrest he's very good at trickery and deception. So yeah, after taking Union City and the prisoners there, he later speeds past Dresden and Mackenzie. He does get ambushed here at Parker's Crossroads. At first, he's going all right because he's able to use his 12-pounders fairly well. However, later on, the Union do get reinforced and he's choked back. And there's an anecdote here that there was one scout who did not give him proper information. And what happens is Forrest grabs the guy by the scruff of his neck and beats him up nearby this waterway. Like, he just beats him, got almost an inch of his life. He's just that enraged by poor scouting that helped to lead him into this ambush on his way to Clarksburg. So yeah, he gets over to Lexington where there's another battle. Yeah, and that's sort of like the brief campaign he did of West Tennessee. Now it's worth noting that at this time, yeah, you do have like the railway here, which was being harassed. Now, this railway, for example, helps to feed the Vicksburg campaign that Grant and Sherman are conducting to take over Vicksburg. And this is the start of the time where Sherman refers to Forrest as the devil, to put it frankly, refer to him as a devil, because really, Forrest, although he was very audacious and very offensively minded and very much a brilliant mind, almost at this time, goes up Grant and Sherman, they know full well what Forrest's gig is. On the one hand, they're not surprised that, because it's just the problem is, it doesn't matter what cavalry guy you send out against him. It's just a fact that Forrest was just too brilliant. Like, there's no way you can succeed against him. Like, at the moment in time, it's really towards the end of the war. Like in April 1865, they just get beaten, and even then, like, that's a time where attrition rates are just really high, desertion mainly, and that's what beats him more than the actual Union troops. So yeah, you just have this position where he's seen as very slippery, very sort of hard-hitting, very surprising attacker, and the Union generals in the area just absolutely dread having to deal with him. So yeah, you have. Meanwhile, here, so in early 1863, so February 1863, there's a defeat here at a place called Dover, which is right next door to Fort Donelson. Now, the thing about this battle was a guy called Joseph Wheeler was in charge. Now, Joseph Wheeler was a guy who he was called Fighting Joe, very brave guy. Wasn't the sharpest tool in the shed, it has to be said. Not the sharpest tool in the shed. So he just ordered an attack on Dover, which was heavily dug in with Union troops. Forrest advised against it, but because Wheeler was a main one in command, even though Wheeler was actually 15 years younger than Forrest, the attack goes ahead, and loads of Forrest's troops under his command get killed rather unnecessarily. And after this, there's a letter which I won't quote it verbatim fully what it said, but to paraphrase, it essentially said, look, after this, he said to Wheeler, "Look, I consider you my friend, and you may have my sword if you should ask for it, but make sure you mention in your report to Bragg after all this that I will be in my coffin long before I ever serve under your command again." And the thing about Wheeler, like Wheeler was really distraught when he heard that. Very stern rebuke. It's like, almost as stern and terrifying a rebuke as what Jeb Stuart received off Robert E. Lee at Gettysburg. Wheeler kind of. Yeah, the thing about Wheeler, yeah, he wasn't the sharpest skirmisher. He shouldn't have been in command for this. He was a poor fit, but Bragg just hated Forrest that much. He just refused to have Forrest in command, and this unnecessary disaster just ended up happening. And I'd put blame more on Bragg in a sense, like Joseph Wheeler. I mean, at the end of the day, he's a cavalry guy, similar to Jeb Stuart, in the sense that he's a vainglorious, very aggressively minded guy, but he's not the sharpest tool in the shed. And I put more blame on Bragg than I do Wheeler, to be honest. Because yeah, I mean, it's as much as you can blame Joseph Wheeler for the screw up he made there. I also would blame Bragg as well, because Bragg just allows his personal vendetta with Forrest to screw over the wider Confederate progress in the stage of war. So yeah, and later on, yeah, you do have them wheeling down through Centerville as they cross the Dug River, began to Columbia, and then later on, yeah, they do another raid here into central Tennessee, where you have, for example, a battle of Brentwood, and then on their way back, you have a battle at Franklin. There's not much to be said about these battles; they're more skirmishes in the grand scheme of things. You also have Thompson Station as well, where Freeman, that was it. Freeman, his artillery guy, gets killed. So yeah, Forrest was very distraught when Freeman got killed, because the thing was, early on, back in, I think this was like October, November time in 1862, you have this position where Bragg tried to replace Forrest's artillery guy Freeman with a guy called Morton, and Forrest was just very much like, he liked Morton personally. Like, he got to know the guy over time, and he did take on him, and he was a good replacement for Freeman, but he resented this interference from Bragg all the damn time. Because the thing about Forrest was he was not a stickler for military discipline, and Bragg really resented that about him. So yeah, you have these ways. Now, not long after, you have Abel D. Strait. If I can, did I? Yeah, this is Abel D. Strait. Now, the thing about Abel D. Strait was he was Ulysses S. Grant's pick for the cavalry guy to take on Forrest, because alongside him there was a guy called Benjamin Grierson, who I'll mention in a Ulysses Grant stream. Grierson was another cavalry guy who was tasked with tearing up Confederate supply lines linking Vicksburg to the rest of the Confederacy, to the rest of the Deep South, and up to Richmond. Meanwhile, Abel D. Strait was dispatched to take care of the railway junction around Chattanooga. So you think of railways from Chattanooga that link westward. So, for example, you have a railway, for example, that links to Corinth. You have like these railways here that go through Decatur, Huntsville, Bridgeport. So Chattanooga is right at the edge of Tennessee as it meets with Georgia. And Chickamauga is somewhere around here, which would be a later battlefield. So yeah, you have Abel D. Strait. Now, it's worth noting that at this point, Forrest, he does have to serve another commander of Van Dorn. Now, Van Dorn, very brave cavalry officer, nowhere near as brilliant as Forrest. Again, this is just a matter of, I mean, Van Dorn does do fairly all right, because especially in Mississippi, he knows that state like the back of his hand, because he's from there, and he does do a fair bit to screw over Grant in the Vicksburg campaign in his own way. However, yeah, Forrest should have been commanding again for this. Like, he was more brilliant, and so Van Dorn and Forrest, they originally set off with 1,500 guys. They're dispatched by Bragg to safeguard Chattanooga. Because you have A-Buddy Strait, who sets off from Nashville on April 7th, and you see here the route. He goes along the rivers, goes along Pittsburgh Landing, Tennessee River, and the thing was, it was at, for example, Tuscumbia here in latter end of April, where he was meant to go along towards Decatur and deal and go right up to Chattanooga, tearing up all the railways and destroying all bridges and so on, all infrastructure that could otherwise support Confederate army movements. However, you have this position where he has to take a detour southward to Russellville because he's having to deal with Forrest screening him along the way. And it's at this point. So the thing about A-Buddy Strait was he was a very brave guy, but like with Joseph Hooker at Chancellorsville, he lost faith in himself once he heard that Forrest was the guy after him. What courage he had seemed to desert him, because it was essentially just a matter of, by this time anyway, Forrest has really gotten a reputation as being the best cavalry commander on both sides that either side could ever muster. So A-Buddy Strait, he just makes a lot of mistakes along the way. Now, yeah, Forrest chases him along the way. There is a battle here at a place called Days Gap on April 30th, where Forrest, he gets defeated. Well, he's not very personally, so it's technically not his defeat, but he loses his 12-pounders there, his 2 cannons, which he really missed. And there's an incident that happens later on, which I'll mention towards the end of the stream. But yeah, there's an artillery guy there, Lieutenant Gold, who he was in charge of the cannons, and he loses them, and his name will come up later in September towards the tail end of the stream. So yeah, you have Forrest. He's pursuing A-Buddy Strait throughout the latter end of April into early May. Now, it's around here at Gadsden, you have Emma Sansom. Now, the thing was, nearby Gadsden, there was a bridge around nearby Gadsden that was destroyed by A-Buddy Strait. Now, A-Buddy Strait's forces were actually really exhausted, to say the least. They really were exhausted, and they were on the brink of exhaustion. They managed to destroy the bridge, hoping that it would stop Forrest. However, and Emma Sansom here, she guides Forrest and his troops to a nearby river ford that she uses to guide her cattle alongside, because it's not just her, but also her mother and her sisters. So the Sansom family, they help Forrest with intelligence, getting to know this nearby river ford, and this is where what security that Strait felt he had by destroying the bridge was pretty much gone. So they're having to retreat for another day up to the area nearby Cedar Bluff in eastern Alabama, between Gadsden and Rome, Georgia. It's at this point he surrenders, because put simply, his troops are exhausted. They really are demoralized because they just didn't get to achieve their objectives, and A-Buddy Strait and his officers, they know full well this is Forrest they're dealing with, but they're under the misguided assumption that he's got more men than they do. Actually, so by this point, A-Buddy Strait has 1,500 men, and he does take a lot of horses and mules from Alabamian locals, but they exhaust them really quickly. They just exhaust them really quick. They die by the droves, unfortunately. So when, for example, Forrest actually obtains what's left of their horses and mules that they took in sort of by extorting off the local population, it's not enough to recoup the losses of those who lost horses and mules to this invading force. So yeah, there's that angle. Plus also with the surrender, the thing was, they were able to Strait, as he thought that Forrest outnumbered him by at least 2-1. Actually, it turned out it was Forrest himself had only 500 men. By this point, he barely had 500 guys and horses. He did get later back his artillery guns, a couple of 12-pounders, and through deception and a great deal of bluff and great sort of intimidating charisma on his part, he's able to get A-Buddy Strait to surrender, because he uses fake cannons, like sort of wooded logs painted like cannons, as well as dummy troops to misguide the Union commander here into thinking he's got the guy absolutely surrounded. So after the surrender, everybody straight is just going to the Forrest, going, "You lied to me! Like you told me you had 500 men," and Forrest is like, "All is found love and war," and yeah, again, yeah, this is a situation where fair to say, it's really just a matter of everybody's straight. Like, he committed a lot of blunders throughout this entire campaign, and a lot of unforced errors, which were of his own making. So I would say, for the large part, he has no one to blame but himself. Because the thing was, Ulysses Grant actually trusted this guy. And Ulysses Grant, I mean, Grant was a very trusting guy by disposition, and he had to overrule Sherman because Sherman was arguing for a guy called Mower, and Mower probably would have been a better pick from what I've read about him in terms of being a lot more calm under pressure. But like, yeah, everybody's straight. As mentioned earlier, he loses his nerve dealing with Forrest around the Tuscany area onward, and yeah, this is where you get it's culminating with surrender near Cedar Bluff. So yeah, so after this, surrender is finalised. You later have Earl Van Dorn. He later gets killed off by a guy whose wife he'd been sleeping with. So yeah, Earl Van Dorn. I mean, yeah, I would say he was a competent guy, but he shouldn't have been wanting, and he should have been having his own separate command rather than having to be the one in charge of Forrest, just because Braxton Bragg had a personal grudge against the guy. So yeah, but meanwhile you have, Forrest after this surrender. After he's got all the equipment he's needed, because this is one thing about the Confederates throughout the wars, they are able to loot supplies off the Union troops for capture, and Forrest has a fair few more pistols and horses and so on. They captures off Abel Straight's forces. So that in the time so in the Battle of Chickamauga, he's able to get his forces well rested and refitted. So yeah, in the midst of June to September, you have Bragg, who understands that, you have Rosecrans, who has been able to outmaneuver him. Now, Rosecrans is actually having to disperse his forces because of terrain in that part of southeastern Tennessee. It's fairly complicated to navigate through. So he's having to split off his forces. Now, Braxton Bragg, really, he should have been able to defeat the Union Army in detail. Instead of having to go up against a fully united Union Army in the later Battle of Chickamauga, he could have defeated guys like James A. Garfield and others in pitch battle and defeat in detail. But if there's one thing you can trust Braxton Bragg for, it's that you can trust him to just miss an opportunity. Just really terrible general. I mean, he did this earlier before in the previous year, the Battle of Perryville, where in the campaign, as I mentioned earlier, the Heartland campaign, yeah, you just have this position where, again, he just maneuvers his army really poorly, even in the midst of like getting good intelligence from guys like Forrest. He just disregards it, and it costs him really heavy casualties in later battles. So yeah, so you see here Chattanooga. This is like the railway here. Chickamauga Station, a tiny station. You got the road to Atlanta here, because the thing about, so everyone knows of Sherman going on to Atlanta in the marches for sea, but originally it was Rosecrans who was meant to take Atlanta in line with marching eastward. But as will be mentioned in a short while, Rosecrans really blunders his way in this particular campaign and in this particular battle in such ways that you think to yourself, it takes a certain kind of general to lose to someone like Braxton Bragg. and Rosecrans wasn't exactly a terrible general. It's just at this particular battle, he was just happened to blunder so many times that yeah, it's just there's no other words other than to say thoroughly what was he thinking in this particular battle, and I will go over that. So yeah, as you can see by the Clash of Swords, this is where you get the battle. You got Reed's Bridge over Peavine Creek. That's it. You also got Lee and Gordon's Mill, Free Fish Spring, Chickamauga Creek, which this is why, by the way, both sides call it Chickamauga. Chickamauga, but of course, being the name of a local railway station, and Chickamauga after the creek for the Confederate side. Who go off, Confederate Creek for the Union side, who go off by river names and waterway names, while Chickamauga for the Confederates, who go off by place names. So yeah, you have Forrest, who's deployed around Reed's Bridge, and this is around the right wing of the Confederate Army, because you have up the left, you have a center. I believe here, like you have glass, like this is where that missionary ridge really becomes a dogged, like good ground for the Union to defend when the Confederates later attack in a battle. But yeah, so September 18th at 3:30 in the afternoon, Forrest crosses Reed's Bridge. He bivouacs here for the night, and then come morning of September 19th, he joins up with guys such as Dibrell and Pegram and so on, when they later attack along the Lafayette-Rossville Road. And he does get later relieved by a guy called Cheatham, who's another cavalry guy under Bragg. So yeah, as you can see, you got Forrest serving alongside Johnson over and nearby Reed's Bridge against a guy called Minty, who later has to withdraw. You do have guys like Liddell and Walker along here as well, on more of a centre around Alexander Bridge, where they do cross through Lambert's Ford, but they take so many hours doing it. Like they initially did a frontal attack at Alexander's Bridge under Bragg's orders, and Walker, he decides to go against this order by Bragg and outflank. And the thing about Bragg is he's in no position to bollock anyone under him. So yeah, this is where Walker does outflank. However, it's at this point, yeah, the battle plan he originally had was all in tatters. So you got Wilder, who's having to retreat towards here, nearby Vineyard and the log schoolhouse, nearby the Lafayette Road, and nearby where Alexander and Lafayette Roads converge. And meanwhile, you got Polk, Leonidas Polk, by the way, who was actually a cousin of James K. Polk. Because it's worth noting, Gideon Pillow, as mentioned earlier, the guy who cowardly fled from Fort Donelson. Gideon Pillow and Leonidas Polk, they're two political generals, and they got a commission at first in the Mexican War because they happened to be good friends or relatives of James K. Polk, the president at the time. And when the Confederates secede, Pillow and Gideon, Pillow, and Polk, they later get commissions on account of the fact that they happen to serve in the Mexican War. Because, as mentioned, you have commissions at that time in the early Civil War just been handed out like confetti on both sides, but mainly the Confederate side were really handing them out like confetti. So on day 2, you have Forrest, who has to pull back a bit, and you have guys like Liddell, Wilson, and Ector along the Reed's Bridge Road that have to deal with a counterattack from the Union side. But then later you have Baird, especially, has to pull back. Palmer has to cover Baird's retreat. On the left flank, meanwhile, you got Joseph Wheeler here fighting Joe Wheeler, who doesn't really deal, nothing really happens. And this is one thing where, if I was Bragg, I would have done an echelon attack, probably. Because you see here, you got Missionary Ridge, formidable ground, what he should have done is he should have defeated them before they could pull back to a better defensive position. And to be fair, Rosecrans also commits his own mistakes, as I'll elaborate in short matter. But yeah, so you have on the center and right, where it's just a bloodbath, both sides just throwing men. Bragg especially, he just throws men like meat at a wall, really just haphazard. way of handling his army, and you have like brigades and regiments on where just get smashed and cut about. Like Forrest does the best he can, but he can only do so much as a subordinate of Braxton Bragg. And yeah, in the afternoon of the second day of Chickamauga, you have Baird, Brannan, Johnson, Palmer, like they also attack. Stewart does attack against Van Cleve, who later has to pull back. Meanwhile, you've got Davis and Barnes. They're attacking towards Johnson's way and Preston. And you've got Forrest here, who's staying back behind Walker's line, besides the Reedsbridge Road, because Forrest wasn't. He was ordered to stay back, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, or at least he did not. At very least, he wasn't really getting adequate support from Bragg for this, and it really was just a massive clusterfuck, to put it bluntly. Yeah, so you have Cheatham, who relieves him, who attacks here. Patrick Claiborne, by the way. I mean, I've heard he's one of the best Confederate generals of the war, so I might think about doing a stream about him later on in the year. Another guy I want to do a stream about later in the year, of course, is Breckinridge, who comes up on the right flank. And John C. Breckinridge, I mean, I would say, for a political general, he was actually the Southern Democrat ticket for the 1860 election. I mean, Breckinridge, I would say, he was a very capable guy, and it's a pity that Jefferson Davis did not use this guy a lot better than he had done. Yeah. I mean, you could say it's political rival, even so. You got that saying, keep your friends close and your enemies closer. So, I think if I was Jefferson Davis, Breckinridge wouldn't even have to just demand only a division or a corps at best. I'd have him as Secretary of War, as he later became in 1865, but it's too little too late. So, you have Breckinridge reinforcing along the right flank, reinforcing alongside Cheatham, Claiborne, and Walker and Stewart, who had to really deal with especially on Stewart's part, he had to do an enfilading defense from lots of Van Cleve and Johnson and so on. And you've got Negley and Davis in reserve alongside Sheridan. So you have Kelly's Field here, where you've got sort of like a semicircular formation under Johnson's division, overlooking Alexander Bridge Road, and you have Breckinridge, meanwhile, who's attacking BT. You have Forrest, who's wheeling around here towards more, because you have Granger's Reserve that's coming from the north, 2 miles north, at a place called McAfee's Church. Van Cleve and Davis are later cobbled over from a right flank to reinforce the left. And this is really unfortunate because later on, Longstreet comes in, as you can see here. You got Longstreet, who comes in to attack Rosecrans's right, and this massive gap in his line really just whatever advantage the Union could have gained, but just by Bragg just being completely incompetent and foolish throughout the entire battle thus far, was spaffed by Rosecrans unnecessarily taking troops from his right to reinforce his left. And so, you just have this general attack that happens, especially in the centre. And right, you got Preston starting to get into position. You got Jump, and you got Hood under guys like Johnson, Law, and McClure. Now just speeding up towards Brannan, and then Van Cleve in the reserve on the third day, mid-afternoon. Oh, crap. And it's fair to say that, you have Longstreet completely just folds up. Longstreet does in this battle, I suppose, what you could say that Jackson had done at Chancellorsville. There's a book by Sam Watkins, how Bragg was hated by his company in Morley Grays of Tennessee. I'll look into that. Thanks for the book recommendation, Alabaster. Cheers for that. my main source about reading about Bragg, I only know about him from like sort of second-hand sources such as Forrest point of view from all biographies of him, plus also that vlogging through history. But yeah, I'll obviously will look up that book and yeah. So yeah, Braxton Bragg, really, it's a matter of this battle of Chickamauga was won in spite of him, not because of him. It was because of Longstreet really doing to the Union Army this day what Jackson did to Hooker over Chancellorsville. So yeah, this battle is won. Now, shortly after this battle, there are the main guys such as Cheatham, you got Breckinridge, Liddell, Longstreet, and so on, Claiborne. They actually go complaining to Jefferson Davis directly, saying, "Look, you need to get rid of Braxton Bragg because the guy made every mistake possible, and it was only because of Longstreet reinforcing the Confederate left, attacking the Union right through the massive gap formed that the Confederates even won the battle because the cavalry, like the casualties on Chickamauga, like over those 3 days, it was something like it was bloodier than Antietam. It was something like 18,000 Confederate casualties and 14,000 Union casualties. It was just a matter, as aforementioned, like Bragg really should have defeated in detail all these, like because you had guys like Crittenden who was a fair way away from Rosecrans, like even just a few days before September 18th. He should have just attacked in detail, but he didn't, and he just allowed all the Union forces in there to bunch up and really give him a really terrible fight at Chickamauga, real bloodbath, and yeah. So Jefferson Davis, a few days later, he actually does go over to this area of Chickamauga. He goes up to guys at Longstreet and Breckinridge and Cheatham and Polk, and he asks them, "Do you agree that we need to get rid of Braxton Bragg?" And all 5 corps commanders under Bragg, they all agree that he has to be gotten rid of. And there's even a lot of the middle level officers are also thinking the same. A lot of the rank and file soldiers as well. I'm thinking the same. Like, but the problem was Braxton Bragg happened to be a favourite of Jefferson Davis, and it's for that reason that Braxton Bragg, despite being very unpopular with his own army, even to the point where all five corps commanders who fought alongside him wanted him gone, and fought under him who wanted him gone. But yeah, it was just a matter of Jefferson Davis just refused to sack him, and it's a terrible shame because had Braxton Bragg been sacked, I mean, to be fair, it would have been too late anyway for the to really affect the outcome of a war. But yeah, this really sells into perspective how much of a tragedy Albert Sidney Johnston's death at Shiloh really was, because Albert Sidney Johnston, for example, he really appreciated Forrest, and Forrest actually did really like Albert Sidney Johnston, but yes, his untimely death at the Battle of Shiloh really screwed over Confederate cause in the Western Theater, and this is one reason why, as aforementioned my Jackson stream I did last week, I really don't like this reasoning that people use to say, "Oh, Jackson's overrated because he had some really poor opposition," and I'm like, well, and that gets me thinking because Grant and Sherman had to deal with some really poor opposition on the Western Theater as well. I mean, had guys like Leonidas Polk, Gideon Pillow, and Braxton Bragg. Those were some really poor opposition on the part of the Confederates to field against someone like Ulysses Grant. And no one faults Ulysses Grant for facing off against such poor opposition. But that argument is used against guys like Robert E. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia when fighting against guys like George B. McClellan, fighting against Joseph Hooker, Ambrose Burnside, and so on. Like, as was John Pope at the Battle of Second Manassas. So yeah, this is one where, yeah. Oh yeah, this is one. I mean, one of the main reasons why I'm doing my streams is because so you got Aton Shea and other people like that who are very biased towards the Union side, which I've got no problem with, except for the fact that they just engage in all this moralizing crap. To put like they just have to deal with moralizing crap. Like every time you talk about Nathan Bedford Forrest, for example, or Robert E. Lee, or Stonewall Jackson, or whomever else on the Confederate side that I happen to like studying, it's always you having to caveat it with going, "Oh well, these guys were evil," and like, well, no, like people are complicated. to say the least. It's just complicated. I'm not in the business of denouncing men who, for example, they sided with the states they lived in against a federal government they saw as overbearing. In the same way that it's like that Donald Trump quote about fine people on both sides. That's easily used about the American Civil War. Like, there's no controversy to say that Ulysses Grant is a great man. Now, some of us people who celebrate him are eager to denounce him because during the Western theatre campaigns he did, Grant actually chucks out the Jews. I believe in Mississippi area, if I'm not mistaken. I believe I think it was Mississippi. In the lead to the Vicksburg campaign, he actually chucked out all the Jews in his particular department, and he later did regret it. But the thing is, a lot of the people who celebrate Grant, they generally like to admit that, or they just don't really like talking about it. And it's just, it's a matter of like, and it's not just that; it's also, for example, there's a fair argument to say, the Southerners were the Southerners were hubristic. My perspective on the Civil War is that the Southerners were hubristic. Like, they thought that they were fighting for a system that basically was on the way out anyway. As I mentioned, as I said 2 weeks ago with you, I think slavery was done for anyway. I think the South was insanely hubristic. That being said, however, the way the Union was going about things, like celebrating John Brown and as well as arguing for complete abolition right there and then, and doing stuff like, I'm minded to think the Civil War is just a great tragedy on both sides. Looking from an outsider's perspective, so that's my perspective on the Civil War. I was gonna put my perspective on Civil War towards the end of the streaming series, when latter end of April, but I might as well could say now because I'm finishing ahead of schedule because I was planning on 2 hours. But Braxton Bragg, he doesn't get the sack, even though the vast majority of guys serving under him want him gone, because Jefferson Davis just will not sack him. Like, it's too much. Like, and that's the thing. Like, Braxton Bragg, he has a one good friend, from Jefferson Davis, and to quote what Sam Houston used to say about Jefferson Davis, he was as ambitious as a Lucifer and as cold as a lizard. And the thing about Jefferson Davis was he could be very cold and very spiteful towards people who he disliked, but also very warm-hearted and very loyal to guys who he befriended. Braxton Bragg being one of them, spelled, and that's the thing. Like, you just have a situation where Braxton Bragg was held far too long in command than he should have been. I mean, PGT Beauregard, or perhaps someone like, I'd say either Patrick Clayburn or John C. Breckinridge should have been commanding the Western Theatre, in my humble opinion, because they would have been far better commanders, especially John C. Breckinridge. I mean, Breckinridge, as I said, was a political guy. He was a Southern Democrat guy. He was actually the presidential pick for the 1860 election, but very capable guy. And by the time he got promoted to a place where he should have been, too little, too late. Thinking about John Brown as well, is like, I can also be nuanced about him in the sense of, well, he was fighting against slavery, and to be fair, there was a fair argument to say perhaps the Southerners, they were doing the system in such a way that slavery could never be abolished. However, I also think the Union, the way they're going about it, it was just a matter of, because this is one thing that people don't mention about Abraham Lincoln, was the fact that he actually planned on, once liberating the slaves, because the thing about Lincoln was he did believe in abolishing slavery, but he was not an egalitarian in the way we think of him today. Like, he did not believe in racial equality in the way that the average libtard who celebrates him think he does. Like, he did believe that the white race was intellectually superior, and he believed that the blacks would be better served by shipping them all off to Liberia, which I gotta say, like, that's kind of one of those things where, imagine in an alternate world where America banned slavery and they just ameliorate the problem by going, oh, we're just gonna ship all the blacks over to Liberia. Like, how much anguish that later happens in our timeline would have been saved from America's future. It's massive what. There's a lot of what if scenarios about the American Civil War, which is why I'm so interested. And yeah. Yeah, so shortly after the Battle of Chickamauga, you have Braxton Bragg, who he goes up to Forrest and he says, "I'm taking your cavalry command off you, and I'm going to give it over to Wheeler." At this point, Forrest absolutely explodes in anger for obvious reasons, because he's just looking at this going, it's been a constant campaign of Braxton Bragg just beating down the guy, because you have this, I think it was latter end of 1862, if I remember correctly, or midway through 1862, where Braxton Bragg already did that before to Forrest, and Forrest kind of had to accept it, and Wheeler took a lot of his troops just after the first West Tennessee raid. Second time, he's equipped and trained his troops of his own time and money and effort, because you got to factor and say, like, before the war, Forrest had something like $1.5 million on him, and he spends that fortune on training and equipping his own forces. By the end of the war, for example, he's skinned, basically, and you have someone like Braxton Bragg who just constantly just beats down on him, like just constantly just does not give him any sort of rest whatsoever, and just constantly tries to take away his cavalry from him. After Chickamauga, this was the last straw for him, and he just went, you know what? Like he said to Braxton Bragg, he actually went up to the guy face to face, pointed his finger at the guy, and just went, "Look, I don't care like, what you say. Like, you're not taking my command off me, and if we ever have to have words again, I will kill you with my own hands." It's not a precise quote, but that's basically what he said, and it's a wonder in the sense that it kind of says something about Forrest that he did not get court-martialed for that, because I think Braxton Bragg knew full well that if he were to try and court-martial Forrest, his own army would try to kill him. To say the least, that it would not be hyperbolic to say that if Braxton Bragg escalated it to a court-martial after what Forrest said to him in that one-on-one sort of interview, shall we say, that if he tried to court-martial Forrest probably would have killed him right there on the spot. And I don't think, and I think either that or someone under Bragg's command would have killed him, because put simply, Forrest was very popular with the men. And yeah, I mean, the thing about Bragg was he was a dour disciplinarian. Like, for example, I believe at one point he was in charge of a garrison. This is before the Civil War, but where he actually had an argument with himself, like, because he had such high standards for everyone, including himself, that no one could actually abide by. And then he would just cause trouble for people, just end up screwing people over, and just causing loads of aggro when it need not be done. At one point, he actually investigated himself for that military corruption, because of that he was just bored. And yeah, that kind of tells you how hated Braxton Bragg really was amongst his men. So yeah, after this, Forrest actually writes a letter to Jefferson Davis as well, appealing for his own independent command. And because Jefferson Davis actually quite likes Forrest, like, I believe the two met early on in the Civil War, but I haven't found a record of it. Or at the very least, Jefferson Davis knows the guy by reputation. He likes Forrest, and he does acquiesce, because, put simply, Forrest, he does say in very stern and very upfront language to say, "Look, I will not serve under Bragg, and I would sooner be McCoffin than serve under him again." And Jefferson Davis understands this, and he does give Forrest his own independent command. And yeah, shortly after this, on September 21st, so one thing Forrest does after the Battle of Chickamauga was he demotes this guy called Lieutenant Gold. Now, I did mention Lieutenant Gold as the artillery guy who lost the two 12-pounders at the Battle of Days Gap, earlier dealing on with April D. Straight's raid. Now, Lieutenant Gold actually took this demotion and reassignment very, very heartily, to a point where he actually went out to kill Forrest. So he goes into Forrest's office, and tries to kill him with a pistol, and he pierces his hip, and he nearly, and and at first, like the doctor who treats Forrest, like the surgeon, he says to Forrest, "This wound looks mortal. It looks like you touch your intestines, and it looks like you're gonna." At this point, Forrest then storms out the building and he hunts for gold, and he finds gold like after like a 15-minute walk outside the building. He finds him like a few streets away, and the surgeon is trying to cajole him, trying to say, "Look, don't go. Like I need to treat you." And Forrest says, "No, look, this guy shot me, and I'll be damned if I'm not going to let someone who shot me live on." So and he said words to the effect of, "This man has mortally wounded me, and I will kill him." So he goes with a knife. He actually, right after the guy shot him, he actually did get a blade and like stabbed the guy and almost disemboweled him on the spot. It was only because Gold was able to get away in time that he was able to run away. However, he was mortally wounded, and he does bleed to death on a table a few streets away from where Forrest was. Forrest actually, at first, he was very cold towards the guy, understandably, because the guy tried to kill him. But he later goes up to Gold's deathbed, and the two reconcile, and it's really a matter of, well, Forrest at first he's saying, well, the guy does, and I don't care. But on the other hand, he also apparently he did forgive the guy, and he did not hold any grudges against Gold after that point, and the guy does die shortly thereafter. And Gold actually says words to the effect of, "I hope that bullet I put in you does not kill you. I hope you survive because you are much needed for our cause," which he very much was. And Forrest really becomes a very important guy. No, yeah, just to. So these are some of Forrest's subordinates. So, for example, you have the Kentucky Brigade under this guy, Ryan Lyon. You've got Morton. This guy, Morton, he later replaced. He's Forrest's second artillery guy after the death of Freeman early on, back in like mid to late 1862, if memory serves me right, or early 1863. I forget. I think it was Battle of Thompson Station, I believe it was. Yeah. So Freeman gets killed and Morton replaced him. And Morton was actually quite a capable guy, and Forrest liked him. Although at first it was severed by the fact that Morton was Bragg's pick, and he actually turned out to be a good pick. But it's really unexpected that the two get on. And one thing you'll notice is that Forrest, he has some of his brothers, such as Jeffrey Forrest. He actually commands a brigade under Forrest's own command. When Forrest gets his own independent command, leading his own cavalry corps, or a cavalry division, I believe. I think it was his own separate cavalry corps, because the Confederate division are how the Confederates order their cavalry. Up until battles like Gettysburg and onward, the Union, they organised their cavalry as being attached to an infantry brigade. In the Confederate Army, the cavalry is its own separate branch, which is why guys such as Nathan Bedford Forrest and Jeb Stuart and Turner Ashby for the Valley campaign, they really do become very capable in their own right. And that's because they have a lot more latitude in their decision making compared to the Union cavalry, who they don't have that same initiative. And also because the Union cavalry guys, it's fair to say that they were not good cavalrymen compared to the South. Like, for example, I'll try and find I forget which picture it was. I'll find him. Abraham. Where is he? Where is he? That's Starnes. Where is he? Where's Abraham Buford? Where is he? Abraham Buford here. He's actually a cousin of John Buford, the same cavalry guy who's played by Sam Elliott in the Gettysburg film. So Abraham Buford is actually got back real guy's cousin at this time. So Abraham Buford, he was a horse breeder up in Kentucky, and he is a very capable subordinate of Forrest, especially later on in the war when he's commanding a division of Forrest's cavalry. Yeah, so it was like Cavalry Corps. I don't know what sort of Cavalry Division. My mistake. But yeah, so Brigadier General Abraham Buford, very capable guy. And the thing about Forrest is he had a very lot of good contacts within Tennessee and Kentuckian society. So Abraham Buford, being a Kentuckian, that also helps later on when you have a later raid into Kentucky for later recruitment purposes. So yeah, you have Forrest. Yeah, there were quite a few anecdotes. Like for example, there was one time where I forget which which campaign it was. I think it was the first raid into West Tennessee where they were trying to cross the Cumberland River, and this one officer serving under Forrest refused to cross the river because he was hydrophobic. And Forrest, he pretty much just gets an oar and smacks the guy over the head with the oar, saying, "Come on, you Nancy! Like you'll fight for me and die a hero. You will coward here and die a coward." And words to that effect. Like the thing about Forrest, as many of his anecdotes show, and you can also read about him in your own time. I will put the sources beneath in a comment after this is done for if people want to read up. There's plenty of anecdotes where you look at Forrest and you think he must be some sort of natural god of war in human form. There's no other way around. Other way around it. Like he really is just very, very easy to anger, but also very audacious to a point where whatever thoughts he had as a person, like some people might dread being commanded by him, but you certainly knew that if you served under him, you were like the escort company, especially, which were like kind of his own personal bodyguard, but also some of his most audacious and brave troops. And I mean, so I wonder I wonder how many shots one could take if I by every time I take a shot, every time I say audacious in the context of describing Nathan Bird to Forrest, but there's no other way around to put him. Simply put, he was not a guy who submitted to military discipline. He commanded his troops by sheer force of will. He does very well under his own independent command. Like, he really flourishes. But I will say, as I will later mention in next week's stream, while he was great on a tactical and operational level, I would not say he was great at a strategic level. Like he did the best he could, but there were times where he could have done better, harassing especially Sherman's supply lines for later on becomes a march to the sea. So you do have Nathan Bird of Forrest throughout the entire. So from the start of the war, he's gone from private, and at this point of the war, he's now, I believe, Major General. He's not yet a Lieutenant General. I believe that happens in latter end of 1864. But yeah, it's the steepest rise, like from start to the top of any guy in the Civil War. And I hope people watching this understand why I do agree with Shelby Foote's assessment that this guy has to be one of the most brilliant minds of the entire American Civil War by far. Like you just look at ground and know how to use it. So yeah, I'll end off with some quotes. So for example, one quote is, so Forrest was, I'll share the tab. So Forrest was kind, humane, and extremely considerate of his slaves. He was overwhelmed with applications from a great many of his class who begged him to purchase them. He seemed to exercise the same influence over these creatures that in a greater degree he exercised over the soldiers, who in later years served him as devotedly as though there was between them a strong personal attachment. When a slave was purchased for him, his first act was to turn him over to his black valet, Jerry, with instructions to wash him thoroughly and put clean clothes on him from head to foot. Forrest applied the rules of cleanliness and neatness to the slaves, which he practiced for himself in his appearance in those antebellum days. He was extremely neat and scrupulous clean. In fact, so particular was he in regard to his personal appearance that some were almost inclined to call him foppish. The slaves who were thus transformed were proud of belonging to him. He was almost always very careful when he purchased a married slave to use every effort to secure the husband or wife as the case might be, and unite them, and in handling children, he would not permit the separation of a family. Now, granted, yeah, it's from a guy called Colonel George W. Adair, which he was a guy who actually served under Forrest. Uh, he was actually a guy who was around Forrest, not so much in the wartime days as much. He did serve in the Forest, I believe, but I don't think as like direct subordinate. But certainly he did know Forrest in the days in the antebellum, and it's up to the interpretation whether you think that, because it's worth noting that washing slaves, I mean, that could also be an incentive from his part, where if you wash a slave and you take good care of them, it could kind of be one of those things where it gets a higher price for you. You know, you can sell them for higher prices, and you can, yeah, and you can get more money that way. So another good. Bloody thing loads. Uh, yeah, but yeah, in short, so the thing was, yeah, so in his early battles, he was so disregarded for of the ordinary rules of tactics, on account of the fact he never went to West Point, so he didn't have to be. So in a way, that kind of accentuates his brilliance on the battlefield, in the sense that he didn't depend on Napoleonic tactics. He's depending much more on skirmish and sort of low intensity conflict to have maximal strategic effect. So reckless in personal exposure that I felt sure his career would be short. It seemed certain that he should meet a skillful opponent, his command would be utterly cut to pieces. So fierce was his passion that he almost became equally dangerous to friend and foe. And as it seemed to some of us, he was too wildly excitable to be capable of judicious command. Later, we became aware that excitement neither paralyzed nor misled his magnificent military genius. What had seemed to us the most unreasonable command, when given, proved, both in result and explanation afterwards upon the actions in which he commanded, consummate generalship. His genius in action rose to every emergency. He always did what the enemy least expected him to do, and when defeated, as others would have come to defeat, he was more fertile in resources, more energetic in attack, more resistless in his fiery onset than when the action began. While his desperate bravery and frequent charges were characteristic of his military career, they by no means exhausted his resources. The maneuvering of his forces in the presence of the enemy, his messages to opposing commanders, his matchless shrewdness in impressing them with the overwhelming superiority of his forces and the necessity for surrender were equally characteristic. The use of his artillery, often thrust forward to the skirmish line, which would have been madness in an ordinary commander, was vindicated by the splendid results which he won. His common sense led him at an early date to see that the day was past when a cavalry charge of sabres could be made effective in the presence of infantry. To add on from that, so the thing about the Union troops was they had rifled muskets, which after the Battle of Balaclava, where you have a thin red line, because previous standard practice in line with Napoleonic era tactics was that when you're fighting off against a cavalry charge, you form square. However, the minier balls that we were using from 1851 onwards, especially, meant that you could fire at 400 yards. The range and accuracy were far better than what an average smoothbore would be. So, in other words, cavalry charges were now about to get obsolete. You know, they're already obsolete. They already became obsolete later on anyway because of machine guns. But especially at this time, you have this position where the rifled musket mean that you don't have to bother forming square. All you need is a good volley from a good line of troops, and that's it. A cavalry charge can be blunted, so you have to be smarter about it. You can't. It's not like Joachim Muller, who could do these astounding cavalry charges about all like Eylau and Austerlitz and so on. Instead, you have to take somewhat Forrest, who uses the cavalry as more like mobile infantry. Because at the Battle of Chickamauga, for example, he often uses his cavalry as mobile infantry. If they go up to a place and, let's say, they join a defensive position, or they might join in the attack, and then remount their horses at a later point when it comes to the pursuit. It's not the only year of this kind of tactic took place, because same things happened in the 100 Years' War, where what would happen is you'd have an English force of men at arms, they'd have their horses parked in the rear. So the men at arms, they would ward off the French force. Then, once the French were in terminal retreat and fully routed, that's when the men at arms on our side would, because they're less tired, because they're on top of a hill, for example, in a good defensive position, but remount their horses and chase down the enemy. Same goes here for Nathan Forrest in some of his battles, where he dismounts his forces and remounts to chase them down. Or in the case of cavalry, he can also use them to scout really well, which is why, in the case of, as I mentioned, there was one time where in a previous campaign, as mentioned in the stream, he did actually smack about this one scout. He gave him really poor information, and the thing about Forrest was he was not one to suffer fools gladly, as this stream has illuminated. So, yeah. Yeah. Oh, and just another thing to say. So it says, overwhelming superiority of his forces and the necessity for surrender. Now, that can be a good allusion to the Fort Pillow massacre. Now, the Fort Pillow massacre, I won't go into it tonight, but I will mention it next week, and that'll be a big part of me explaining away the controversy, because I agree with Garnet Wolseley, British Army general, who actually met with Nathan Bedford Forrest in the war, as well as Stonewall Jackson and Robert E. Lee in Longstreet. So Garnet Wolseley, he wrote an article for a New Orleans newspaper where he said, look, what Forrest did at Fort Pillow, and people say Forrest could be brutal, and I go, the thing about Forrest was he applied the same rules of warfare as did Cromwell in Ireland, and it's a matter of Forrest did nothing wrong here, and that'll be one of the main sticking points I will do in next week's stream. So I will say to people, I hope you all learned something good about Nathan Bedford Forrest, as well as also the Western Theatre, because I was going to talk a fair bit about that, although I'll probably go into more detail about battles like Shiloh when I do Sherman and Grant later on. So yeah, as I said, I'll this is. So I'll be back next week. I should be back on next Thursday. I didn't do a stream because. So as a general rule of thumb, my streams will either be on Thursdays or Fridays, mainly because no one streams on those days, and also because it allows me flexibility in case of, because Duke can do a special stream on Thursdays. So for that purpose, I can do Fridays as well, and this is why. So I should be back next Thursday, doing Nathan Bedford Forrest Part 2, The Devil in the Saddle Part 2, and I've meant to fix the title, but it hasn't registered. So yeah, without further ado, I'll call it into a stream and I'll say good night or good evening or good afternoon, good day, or whatever to everyone listening, and ciao. Right, bye. The stream has been illuminated. As I said, I just had to unlink that share screen. So I hope this stream has done a fair bit to illuminate about Nathan Bedford Forrest. I'll help people to understand why, for example, someone like Shelby Foote has such a high opinion of the guy, as I have explained, and also why I do agree. I would go as far as to say that after the Napoleonic era, he has to be the best cavalry commander of human history. Like, I don't think it's hyperbolic to say that Nathan Bedford Forrest was the finest cavalry commander, especially of the American Civil War. But I'd also say just of the 19th century after Napoleon. So yeah, and I will be back next week. So farewell.